Thank you, and hi everyone. I'm Jean Holloway, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Ottawa, and I work with Jackie Dawson, and this project that I'm presenting today is part of Jackie and McKeel's work with PPP Sarah, building on that, and I will be talking about, yes, how I have determined what weather, water, ice, and climate, or WWIC information users and a particular group of users, end users, and I'll be focusing on ship operators and what they need for safe navigation through Canadian Arctic waters. So I won't go into great detail because I know everybody here is familiar with the fact that the Arctic is changing rapidly, but I wanted to provide some context for the Canadian Arctic situation. So as with the rest of the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic is experiencing rapid changes in temperature, and precipitation changes, so most of northern Canada is experiencing, more rain rather than snow than in the past, and other changes in precipitation, as well as changes in wind and extreme weather events. And notably, there's been rapid declines in sea ice extent and thickness throughout the Canadian Arctic. So regions like, here, let me see if I can, Hudson Bay and Baffin Bay have been experiencing about a 10% decline per decade in sea ice extent since the 1960s. And sea ice thickness has also been decreasing. So we're seeing more thin first-year ice and less thick multi-year ice. But a younger, thinner ice pack means that it's actually more mobile than in the past. And there's more interannual variability, and it's harder to predict sometimes. So this is a figure on the right where you can see that there's multi-year ice moving through Nares Strait into Baffin Bay. And historically, ice arches in Nares Strait from January till about June and July blocked that transport of multi-year ice into the southern Canadian Arctic waters. But that younger, thinner ice pack is mechanically weaker, and so ice arches don't form in all years anymore. And so this is a particularly anomalous year. So it's 2016 and 2017 winter. And you can see the multi-year ice moving, oops, that's the wrong one. Too many things. You can see the multi-year ice moving down through Nares Strait throughout the season and reaching the Newfoundland and Labrador coast in June, which is very unusual. So although there is still ice present, there's less ice, and the ice that is present is more mobile and potentially hazardous. And while these rapid changes are occurring, there's also been an increase in ship traffic, and you heard Jackie speak about this morning in her plenary. So we've seen, since 1990, between 1990 and 2005, there was a period where it was relatively stable, but then at 2005, it shoots up dramatically, increasing by about 90%, and this is particularly true for pleasure craft vessels. So those are things like yachts and sailboats, and that's shown here in gray. And you can see that those are increasing very rapidly after 2005, and that's actually the fastest growing sector in the Canadian Arctic. And that's important because those vessels are often not ice strengthened, and when they encounter conditions where sea ice is present especially, it can cause very major incidents. So there's many examples, including the one on the right side of the figure, where sailboats have actually sank. So this sailboat sank in 2018. So it's very significant, and vessel operators rely on WWIC information to avoid incidents like this and to make safe navigational decisions. So it's very vital to their day-to-day operations that they have WWIC information, but it has to be usable, accessible, and accurate. So, it's great if we have really rich products and incredible products, but if the end users aren't able to use them, access them, or that data isn't accurate at the scales that they need it, it's not usable. It's not useful. So Jackie touched on this as well this morning. So this is sort of the WWIC information value chain. And so it's been noted many times that user engagement throughout this value chain is essential and creates really meaningful products, but the user perspective is often overlooked still. And so that creates what we call a usability gap between what producers of WIC information see as useful information and then what users actually need or what they actually use. So there's a usability gap. And Jackie touched on this. One of the goals of my work is to speak with the users, the end users, and provide the producers with feedback about their products and what the end users need and create more meaningful and useful products. So I had 4 main research questions. What WIC information are vessels operators actually using? And is that information currently meeting their needs? Is it usable, accessible, and accurate? And how and where can WIC services be improved for safer navigation? And then one particular thing we were interested in is were there differences between vessel types in terms of what information they are accessing and what their needs are, and particularly pleasure craft, as I mentioned, versus other vessel types, because pleasure craft is such a unique sector and it's the fastest growing sector. So to answer those questions, I used a mixed method survey using Qualtrics online software. And I targeted vessel operators who had recent experience traveling in the Canadian Arctic. And I got a total of 56 responses from all targeted vessel types, except fishing vessels, unfortunately. And I had a high response rate from pleasure craft operators, which was fantastic, as that was one of the target users. And we actually don't know sort of globally what those operators are accessing in terms of WIC information. So I think this project will be able to provide some insight into that. So most of the participants were ship captains, and they had a range of experience from 1 year to more than 30 years. But interestingly, pleasure craft operators were the least experienced overall. The majority of them had only less than 1 year operating in the Canadian Arctic. So that's an interesting outcome. Overall, the survey participants said that their needs were being met frequently in terms of products and services in the Canadian Arctic, but they said that their voyages could benefit from additional WIC services, and I got some feedback on what they actually needed. So you saw this morning in Jackie's plenary, but I asked each of the survey participants to rank. I listed a series of WIC information factors, and I asked them to rank them in order from most important to least important. So you can see here, this is a graph of showing how many times a particular factor was ranked in a certain position. So on the right side, this is the number of times that certain factors were ranked most important. And then this, in the blue colors, cold colors, is the least important. So overall, participants consistently ranked sea ice concentration as the most important factor. So that's on the right side here, this sort of darkest red color. And so the majority of participants ranked that as the #1 sort of most important factor. And that was followed by wind direction, wind speed, sea ice drift, and sea ice thickness. Also ranked fairly high was horizontal visibility, atmospheric pressure, ocean currents, wave direction, and wave height. And then overall, the least important factors were salinity and vessel icing, as well as other. So that other category was where participants could fill in any factors that I didn't list there that they felt were important, but that was consistently ranked in the last position. Although there were several participants who ranked other in the top 5, see that there, and they mentioned the size of the ice flow as well as water depth as being highly important in those cases. I also, so for factors that were ranked in the sort of 1 and 2 most important positions, I asked a series of follow-up questions about more specific detail in terms of WIC information needs for those factors. And so one thing we asked about timescale and spatial resolution that were needed, and it seems that for time, operators are looking for sort of a relatively short timescale, so information on a 1 day or in real time scale, particularly for sea ice concentration, which is in gray here. And then followed by sort of 3 to 5 days forecasting. So that's what they need to make their decisions. And spatial resolution had less of a clear pattern, but seems that a range of scales are needed from less than 1 kilometer to more than 25 kilometers. For accuracy, most users felt accuracy was satisfactory or very good, so they were quite happy with it, but they suggested more frequent or real-time observations are needed, as well as technological improvements, including satellite technology, among other things. For where services were inaccurate, I got operators, so this is for pleasure craft operators, and they said that the Northwest Passage was an area where services were often inaccurate. And for non-pleasure craft operators, it's not working. Could you just advance the slide for me, if possible? Sorry, everyone. Yeah. Oh. Anyways, for non-pleasure craft operators, it was much more geographically spread. So we didn't see that same pattern with the Northwest Passage. There was areas all over sort of the Canadian Arctic that were pulled out as areas of being inaccurate. Just wrap up maybe. Overall, I'll just sort of summarize my conclusions, and if anyone's interested in the rest of my presentation, I can show it to you later, but overall, it was very interesting. Users were quite happy with the services in the Canadian Arctic. I wanted to emphasize that. Many users mentioned that the services in Canada were very good, but obviously suggested some improvements, including more frequent updates came up a lot, as well as real-time or short-term timescale of forecasts and information needs. The Northwest Passage came up as an area where information was inaccurate, and also internet accessibility is a huge problem, especially for pleasure craft operators. Many of them don't have internet accessibility on board their vessels, so services need to be tailored for those users in particular. Yeah, I think I'll just wrap up with that, and thank you very much for having me, and I'll turn it over back to McKeel.
If you like, I mean, I'm sure there are some questions, so if you would like to stay, that, yeah, at least I think there are. Yes, are there any questions? Maybe also from the chat, but I already see a hand here from Daniela. Yeah.
Don't run away.
Sorry, thank you, Jean, for your great presentation. I was just wondering whether you could explain to us a bit what pleasure craft, that it was just a non-commercial sector, and what about the commercial tourism sector, which I understand is on an increase in the Canadian Arctic as well. Did you look at those as well? Because I couldn't see them on your slide, but maybe I was just not.
Absolutely. So in the survey, I did specify non-commercial and commercial. So I have both in this data set. I grouped them as one, but I could pull them out as separate. And you are correct, tourism is on the rise. Pleasure craft tourism from the commercial sector is on the rise in Canada. So that's interesting. I hadn't thought about pulling them out separately because you would probably see very different results. So thank you for that comment. I'll have a look at that.
I think we could do one more quick question if there is one. Yes.
Just curious, from this morning, a lot of users were using Windy. So did you ask what the source was of the weather information they were getting?
I did, yes. I didn't include it here because it sort of just would be listed, but windy.com came up a lot as well for the ship operators. The Canadian Ice Service was the #1 source for information on sea ice. So I do have, for each of the factors, I do have a list of where the operators are accessing the information, and what I'm hoping to do is then provide sort of feedback or a summary report to the whoever's interested in receiving information about that. So if anyone's here and would like to see my results in detail, let me know. Great.
Yeah, thanks again.